Hello and welcome to Astrology with Zeke. This is going to be my fourth episode in my Stories Behind the Historical Figures series. Today we're going to be doing Rudolf Steiner. So just a little bit about him before we get into his chart. Rudolf Steiner was a philosopher and social reformer from the early 20th century. He was big into educational reform, founding the Waldorf education system. He was also involved in the occult and esoteric community and claimed to be clairvoyant. Most of his philosophical writings have gone under the radar, not because of the content of the arguments themselves, rather because of his connection with esotericism. He was also accused of pushing pseudoscience and pseudo-history. So yeah, that's just a real quick introduction to who that guy is without digging into his chart. Just wanted to get that out of the way. So with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and dig into his chart. Okay, so first things first. Steiner was a Scorpio rising. So what that means is Scorpio is the sign of death and rebirth, of transformation. People with this sign prominent in their chart tend to be intense, brooding, very serious. They don't have a whole lot of humor to them. And in this case, with his chart ruler, which would be Mars, it is in Taurus. So, what does this mean? This means that he approached problems. What was very apparent about him is he was kind of had a dark and brooding kind of aura, if you will, about him. And he would try to solve problems that came his way by reestablishing stability. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about his Mars and the aspects his Mars is making. So technically speaking, Mars is in detriment in Taurus, as Mars is your get up and go, your will to fight, your aggressiveness, assertiveness. Whereas Taurus is a sign that is all about security, stability. You know, they very much do things on their own time. They're pretty unmoved by external events. So it's just an odd placement. That being said, do not mistake that for weakness at all, because if someone with a Mars in Taurus loses their temper, which is hard to do, but when they do, that'll be like a bull in a china shop, and they will come for you, and they won't stop at anything until they attack the threat. And they can be angry for a very long time. Earth signs tend to retain whatever they're holding on to. Now, the first thing I want to get out of the way with Steiner's Mars is it is conjunct his Pluto. And Pluto is a planet that's about the misuse of power. And it gives his Mars an especially destructive flavor. So whenever he lost his temper, it was particularly destructive. That being said, I doubt that happened frequently, as people that have Taurus prominent in their charts, they don't really lose their temper frequently. What's also really interesting that I do want to point out, because while this is could mean that he had a very explosive, almost violent temper when he lost it, is I do want to point out that his Mars-Pluto conjunction is making a really nice trine to Saturn in Virgo. And Saturn's the planet of restriction, of structure, of order. And what this tells me is, although he may have had a highly explosive temper, and as he grew older, he became very adept at channeling it, channeling, that rage into perhaps his work instead of just exploding and losing it. So to my mind, I think this is why he is not known whatsoever for an explosive temper, because I've looked and looked, because that's what this conjunction means. But I mean, nowhere in any documents or sources about Steiner does it mention anything about him having a temper. So I believe he was able to really control, restrict it, and direct it into something more positive. The other aspect that his Mars and Pluto conjunction are making is a really nice sextile to his sun in Pisces. So Pisces is the sign of the artist, the tortured artist, the dreamer. It's someone who's also highly spiritual, which makes sense given who Steiner was. And I believe this sextile, again, would give him a depth, an extreme emotional depth. He's able to look into the underworld, yet come back up unscathed. Being able to go into hell, so to speak, and fight demons and come back up and be just fine. Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about that. That one was pretty easy. So I suppose we can move on to his sun next, because his sun, even though it does have that nice positive aspect to Mars, is part of a T-square. So Steiner's sun is directly opposed to his Saturn in Virgo and squares that Uranus in Gemini, which is in the 7th house. So what this tells me is he kind of goes back and forth between being, that really artistic, spiritual kind of guy, to being a person who is deeply into getting into the nitty-gritty of something, being hyper-focused on the small, tiny little details, which is a very odd mixture, because oftentimes dreamers, poets, spiritual people really aren't that concerned with the teeny tiny details, whereas that Saturn and Virgo absolutely would. And what makes this more odd is both of those planets are making a square to Uranus in Gemini, which is the 7th house. So the 7th house is one-on-one partnerships. And with that being Uranus in that house, that means he's probably had a lot of extreme, unusual, or a lot of upsets in his relationships. And what we can see is he did have a series of relationships. He was married more than once, divorced in his first marriage. And also, he had breakups in academia. He was never really taken seriously, unfortunately, and left. He also rubbed shoulders with different esoteric orders, like the Theosophical Order, but ended up parting ways with them due to philosophical agreements. So I would say that's that T-square in action right there. He had a very hard time finding his people, if you will. So the next formation that I want to talk about is I want to go over Steiner's moon. His moon is also in Virgo. It's co-present that Saturn. And someone with their moon in Virgo gets a lot of emotional security and nurture and feels comforted. It's also the most personal side of their lives. Is someone who, very similar to the Saturn in Virgo, gets a lot out of knowing a certain subject to the umpteenth degree, being very comfortable with getting deep into a subject and knowing it inside and out, knowing every single tiny little detail about whatever they're into. They're highly studious people, very intelligent. And what's interesting is the ruler of his moon, Mercury, is opposed to his moon, and it is in Pisces. So Mercury in Pisces is technically in detriment. Mercury is the planet of the intellect, how we learn, how we communicate. And as I've already mentioned, Pisces is very spiritual, artistic, empathetic. So that planet and that sign just doesn't really get along. However, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because people with this placement can be excellent writers, excellent dreamers. I know one person off the top of my head with this placement would be Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And what we'll also see with Steiner is he was a very prolific writer, was into all kinds of different projects. He also really wanted to bring spirituality and science together, which I feel is very apropos for that moon opposed Mercury, for this placement, because I would say, especially today, people would probably say, or at least a person down the street would probably say, science and spirituality don't go together. And Steiner had a problem with that, and he wanted to bring them together, so to speak, which is very interesting to my mind. I would say it's more odd than harsh. Now, with all that out of the way, what I do want to say is this Mercury is conjunct Neptune. And Neptune is the planet that's all about dissolving boundaries, illusions, and deception. And I've gone over a few people who actually have Mercury conjunct their Neptune. Normally, this symbolizes someone who's really good at deception, at lying, pulling the wool over other people's eyes. However, in Steiner's case, I don't think he was a liar or a con man. Given that this conjunction is in the sign of self-undoing, I would say that he was he probably was psychic. I would say he had a deep connection to the spiritual world, because Mercury is a psychopomp, and is the god that transports spirits to and from different worlds. And Neptune's all about dissolving boundaries, so like dissolving boundaries between this world and the next. However, I would say he had a lot of trouble distinguishing the difference between fiction, dreams, the spirit world, and reality. I think a lot of times for him, they probably seemed one and the same. And what's interesting is in 1966, there was a couple of psychologists. I forget the name of the main one who made this diagnosis, but the psychologist Carl Jung concurred with the opinion. They believed that Steiner was schizophrenic, and given this conjunction, I'm inclined to agree with him. Now, real quick, just to get this out of the way, that doesn't mean that you should throw everything out, that he said. But there are some definite problems when you look at a lot of his historical writings. It does appear that they were heavily influenced by inventions of the time. For example, he wrote a lot about Atlantis and made claims that they had flying machines that were awful lot similar to the flying machines that the Wright brothers invented. So that's just something to keep in mind. What I do want to say as well is he was a prolific literary critic and philosopher, but he never really got traction. The only reason why he didn't really get traction is because of his connection to the occult and esotericism. In academia, never took that seriously. Whenever you look at someone who actually read his writings, even if they didn't necessarily disagree, they had to say that it was very well written philosophy. So, just wanted to make sure I put that out there. Anyways, I think that's all the major aspects that I want to talk about. And I think that'll about do it for Steiner. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun going over Steiner. Very interesting individual. It was pretty fun looking up his chart. I also had to do a lot more research on the guy because prior to even looking at his chart. I didn't know who he was. I only heard his name a couple of times. So again, I do want to stress that if you get value out of his philosophy or, the Waldorf education system, I don't want to discourage anybody from that just because, oh, he might have been crazy. That's not what I want to say. I just want to caution people to take perhaps anything historical that he writes about with a big grain of salt. So, yeah, I think that'll about do it for Steiner. If there's any other historical figures you would like me to cover, please go ahead, leave a name in the comments, and I'll go ahead and check them out. Also, I do offer readings professionally. You can book my services at astrologywithzeke.com. I also have a Substack in which I released a number of articles, including an analysis of the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore. So go ahead and check those out if you are so inclined. Anyways, I think that'll about do it for today, and we'll see you all next time.